Bismillah walhamdulillah as-salatu was-salam ala rasulina wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So today we're going to be covering lesson 11, and as of up till now, the course is only 14 lectures. I'm still debating whether I want to make the course a week longer or not. I think I might just keep it at 14 weeks, inshallah. Some of you guys might have also other courses with IDA, with the Imam Development Program. So I think we're going to keep it at 14 weeks. This is week 11, and then when we get to week 13, it will be the last week of new content. So week 14 will actually be a review session. By now, you guys should have already handed in your one assignment for the whole course. And then all that's left in terms of assessments is the final exam, which is purely multiple choice. So it's not meant to really confuse you. It's meant to be based on just whatever we learned in class, not the recommended readings or any of the additional books, just the lecture content and the PowerPoint. That's what I'll be basing the multiple choice exam on. And I'm not going to try to make it overly complicated, just fair, inshallah. So today we're going to be learning a little bit more about past and future prophecies mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah. And then we're also going to now look at the linguistic miracles of the Quran. Why it is inimitable, why it could not have been imitated by any human being, or even a group of them. So we already covered some scientific facts from the last class. This is a summary of some more signs as well. I'm not going to go through the details of them, but I'm just kind of listing them and their references so you can become familiar with them. When you're actually doing street dawah, you might want to have like just maybe at least 5 empirical evidences that are undisputed, and then those will help, inshallah, to strengthen your dawah arguments. Even though this is a total side note, I've noticed that there's been shahadas like rampant, like by wildfire, at the London Muslim Mosque lately. Like literally in the last day, I think I saw just 3 shahadas on Facebook, and that's not me actually going to the website, it's just showing up on my news feed. So alhamdulillah, a lot of people are accepting Islam. And actually one of the brothers who was taking this course, it looks like he finally got through to his buddy. I don't know if it's his roommate or not, but he finally made shahada after him working on him for basically since the beginning of this course. So that's good to know, alhamdulillah. So some references in the Quran, scientific signs, the orbiting celestial bodies. So in Surah Al-Zumar, it talks about how the stars, they have their own orbit. This is something that was unknown 1400 years ago. People used to think that the star didn't move in its own orbit. We now know that galaxies, the stars, they have like a central section, like for example in the Milky Way galaxy or the Andromeda galaxy, you have a central cluster of stars, and they're all rotating, and then the stars around it are rotating, and you kind of have like this pinwheel effect. And you can see this effect with the galaxies, throughout the universe. And we know that there is no technical stagnant star. So they're all technically moving. Now we know basically, based on, the technology of the James Webb telescope and previous telescopes, we now know that none of the stars are stationary. They're all in an orbit, so this obviously further confirms what the Quran is saying in Surah Al-Zumar. Iron descending down to the earth. Scientists say that iron is not an inherent construct of this earth. It was actually something which was sent down to earth. It must have come most likely from meteorites. And so the Quran is telling us that Allah sent down iron. And so now this is another confirmation with science that they say it was something that was alien to the earth. It was brought down to earth, most likely in the form of meteorites, and then it became obviously used for things like building machinery, building armor, building weapons. So it was obviously intended to be of use to mankind. And then we have in Surah Al-Anbiya that the earth's atmosphere is a protection. We know that if we did not have the ozone layer, our earth would incinerate. We would all basically microwave to death. But because of the ozone layer, it blocks a lot of the ultraviolet rays, preventing a lot of the damage to the earth, but it also works as a blanket. So at nighttime, because we have asymmetrical oxygen gases in the sky, the asymmetrical shape allows for the reflection of some of the heat that's going up to be reflected back down again towards the earth. And just kind of like when you go to bed at night, you'll notice the difference. If you put a blanket over you versus you don't, you're going to feel probably 5-10 degrees difference in temperature. And likewise, the ozone layer also works like a blanket, where at nighttime, even though there's no sun and direct ultraviolet radiation from the sun, there's still some heat being held onto Earth so we don't all freeze to death in the middle of the night. Also, the female bees are called the worker bees in Surah Al-Nahl. And this is important because we now know that the male and female bees, that only the female bees actually do the harvesting of the honey. So the males aren't responsible for this specific task. So how would somebody have known this 1400 years ago? It wasn't really apparent in any of the scientific literature or the communities. So again, science is kind of lagging behind, and the Quran is obviously always bringing us a true testimony of how Allah created the universe, how He created the bee, and how He created everything else within His creation. High altitudes that affect breathing in Surah Al-An'am. Back then they didn't have flying equipment. There was actually a Muslim scholar named Ibn Farnas. He was one of the first people to try to attempt a flying machine, except that he basically just attached wings to his body and jumped off a roof. Apparently it didn't go so well. But my point is that happened several hundred years after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and that's only on a rooftop. You have to go actually several thousand feet into the air, probably about 10,000 feet into the atmosphere before you could start to really feel the deprivation of oxygen in the sky. Or obviously, if you were to climb like Mount Everest, eventually you'd get this feeling that you need like breathing equipment. So this change in the ability to breathe, this is something that was mentioned in Surah Al-An'am. This was not very well known, especially to a place like the Bedouin Arabs, where you basically have like this, large barren wasteland desert where you barely even have any mountains, and even the mountains that are in that region are actually relatively short mountains. They're not very large mountains. For those who've ever been to Mecca and Medina, these are very short mountains. It wouldn't be at the level of altitude to be able to determine this. The pupils dilate while lying. Now, this is just something that obviously with modern day scientific equipment, we can verify this. We've also been able to verify that the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for lying and decision making. So even though that one's not on the slide there, it mentions in Surah Al-Alaq that the nasiya, which is the forelock, it is a lying forelock. So the Quran alludes to the fact that the front part of the brain is that which is responsible for lying, and now with modern day equipment, we can attach electrodes to a person's brain, and based on EMG scans, we can basically see that the front part of the brain lights up specifically when somebody's lying. So again, Islam is already showing science what science later finds out to be true regarding these empirical facts. Empirical meaning observable, identifiable. And then there's a bunch of other science. And as we said, if you watch the video by Dr. Zakir Naik, which is slightly over 2 hours long, he will give you an exhaustive list of scientific signs, more than what we covered in this course. We talked about this sign already, so I'm only going to talk about it for like 30 seconds. Just the fact that the historical pinpoint accuracy of the Quran in differentiating between a Malak and a Fir'aun, because the Bible doesn't make this differentiation. We now know, based on the finding of the Rosetta Stone, that I think was discovered in 1799, that it had 3 languages on it: Phoenician, Koine Greek, which we know, classical Greek, or at least some scholars know the language, and the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Using the Rosetta Stone, we were able to read the hieroglyphics in the tombs of the pharaohs, and we were able to find out that during the time of Musa alayhi salam, Fir'aun actually meant king, but during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, Fir'aun meant palace, and hence why in the Quran you'll see Yusuf alayhi salam refers to the king of his time as a Malik and not as a Fir'aun. So I'm just showing the accuracy here with what was not yet known based on very early historical writings, which we didn't have the skill to decode until around 1799 after discovering the Rosetta Stone. Then we have the revelation regarding the comeback of the Byzantines. We talked about this just a little briefly, which is at the beginning of Surah Al-Rum, where Allah tells us that the Byzantines will be defeated in Adn al-Ardi, in the lowest land. And we said that they literally fought in the lowest altitude, or it was about 394 meters below sea level, the lowest level physically on the earth, which could now, based on science, only be verified using high-tech satellite equipment. But the Quran already alluded to the fact that the Persians the Sassanid Empire, and the Byzantines, the Romans, would fight in this land, which is mentioned in the opening verses of Surah Ar-Rum, or the chapter of the Romans. And they were also defeated within the period of 3 to 9 years. It's just the Arabic word for it is 3 to 9. That's just how it is. And they were actually effectively defeated within the 6 to 8 years of this revelation. So the prophecy was fulfilled. Keep in mind that nobody thought that the Byzantine or Roman Empire could ever make a comeback, because the Persian Empire was the stronger of the two superpowers, and there was a huge onslaught from the Persians attacking the Byzantines or the Romans, and they were so weak that nobody at that time, from a logical point of view, would have argued they had any chance at being able to defend themselves, but yet they were able to defeat the Persians. And then with the what do you want to call it? The prophecy of Abu Lahab. Assalamu alaikum, shabab. So obviously you guys know this surah pretty well. Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab ma aghna anhu malahu wa ma kasab sayasla naran dhata lahab wa imra'atuhu hammalat al-hatab fi jidiha hablum min masad. So this surah, pretty much everybody knows it from Surah Al-Masad. It says, may the hands of Abu Lahab be cursed, and ruined is he. His wealth will not avail him, or that which he gained. He will burn in the fire, a blazing flame. So what's interesting here is that this surah, which is talking about one of the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ, his name is Abu Lahab. So Lahab actually means fire, and that's why it kind of works with this surah. And the other thing is that Abu Lahab never accepted Islam. Abu Lahab was one of the most staunchest enemies of Islam. And this surah was a very early surah, very early Meccan surah. And if Abu Lahab wanted to just deceive the Muslims, if he wanted to actually make the Quran look like it was going to contradict itself, all he had to say is he could have just faked his Islam. He could have made shahada for one day, and then he could have committed kufr the next day, and then he could have used that as an argument and he could have said, see, look, I just disproved the Quran. But he didn't do that. And Allah knew that he would never do that, because Allah is Al-Alim. So Allah prophesied that he would end up being from the kuffar while he was still alive. He had the opportunity to make tawbah, but he never took it. And Allah knew that he would never take it. So hence why the Quran was obviously never defeated on this point. So just something to think about, how when Allah decrees that a certain person is going to be from the hellfire, then we see that when we observe that person's particular life, that they never make tawbah, that they never go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and unfortunately that means that they're going to live a life of doom in the hellfire. May Allah protect us. So now getting into the linguistic miracles of the Quran. I'm not an Arabic grammarian. I'm not from the Lughawiyyin. I'm not an Arabic linguist, but I'm just going to try to, in a very simplified form, show you some of the linguistic features that prove that the Arabic language found in the Quran was beyond the ability of all the poets of Quraysh and all the poets that would come into the future and any from the past. So basically, regardless of any time or location, there would be no person who understood the Arabic language who would ever be able to compete with the Quran. By the way, the Quraysh, they tried in their lifetime, but they failed miserably, and that's why they went to a war with swords against Muslims, because they could not intellectually defeat their argument. That's why also they didn't try to spend that much time trying to fight with the Quran. They just tried to use propaganda against the Prophet ﷺ. They accused him of being mad, a fortune teller, a kahin. They accused him of being a sahir, a magician, because they knew that there wasn't much they could say directly about the Quran. So they had to make it sound like you would be bewitched if you would hear the Quran. This was the tactic of Walid ibn al-Mughira, who was actually the lead of the shu'ara, of the poets of Quraysh, and this was part of his deceptive propaganda. But even he admitted, which we're going to find a slide on this later on in the PowerPoint, he admits that he has never heard something more sweet, meaning the Quran, compared to anything that he's ever read or heard from mankind or the jinn. It's pretty interesting that in his whole life, and he was considered the best poet of his time, who lived during the lifetime of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So regarding the linguistic features, there is balagha or eloquence. So this is like advanced literary poetry or linguistic devices that the Quran uses. The grammatical structure is the most precise, and basically, actually, the entire Arabic language goes back to using the Quran as a reference to develop all of its grammar. So at the time, Mohab, do you mind closing the door? Because we can just kind of hear a little echo, I think, from the people outside. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, most people were ummi, they were illiterate. They didn't know how to read or write. There were a few exceptions, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, but most people actually, even amongst the Sahaba, most of them did not know how to read or write. The Prophet ﷺ himself did not know how to read or write. So when you see very advanced grammar beyond the capacity of the Arabs at that time, and then it becomes a reference point for the future, that's another linguistic feature of the Quran. Also, in terms of word choices or sarf and morphology, the Quran uses the most specific and most powerful language that you could use in any given context. And there's a lot of darus you can find online about this, for like even, for example, in Ataynak al-Kawthar. So even the idea of Kawthar. Kawthar means a lot of a lot, like something which is overly abundant, which more overly abundant things come from. Allah could have used the word kathir or kathiran, He could have used a different word, but it would not have had the same power and effect as that particular word. So word choice is also very important. Also the letter sounds, the phonics. So if you look at Surah Takwir, you'll notice like the whole surah, it kind of sounds like something is almost like shaking back and forth. And if you read the surah, you'll see like it's talking about the Day of Judgment, and it talks about like all these graphic images of like, like for example, the mountains exploding and how everybody's going to be gathered into one local area. So it's a very powerful and very violent surah. And because of that, you also find that the sounds of the letters give that vibe, in addition to the fact that the meaning is also there. And then there's the overall meanings as well. Because even if somebody was to come up with something like the Quran, and some people have tried. There's actually a website, I don't encourage you guys to go to it, but I heard it one time from a Muslim brother. It was like a surah like this, something like that. And so what they do is they try to imitate the sound of the Qur'an, but as far as the meaning of what's being said, it doesn't have anywhere near the meaning of the Quran. So they think by just imitating the melody, they think they've imitated the Quran, but you didn't imitate it in terms of its balagha, in terms of its nahu, in terms of its sarf, in terms of its the letter sounds and the overall meaning. So it actually failed in all of these criterion, and all you tried to do was make something that sounded like the Qur'an when they recite. So obviously, that's not a true match. We have, for example, in the Quran, something known as palindromes. Palindromes exist even in English. So a palindrome is when you spell a word or a phrase, and all the letters of the words, if you were to look at the middle of the word, it's basically like a mirror image of the remaining letters. So for example, in English, the word taco cat, the first and last letter is T, second letter and the second last letter is A, and then the third last letter is C, and then O is in the middle. So that's what we call a palindrome. You would have maybe learned this in English elementary school or maybe high school, the latest. And then obviously the other examples like Mr. Owl ate my metal worm. It's a really silly sentence, but it has this pattern called the palindrome, where the first and last letter are the same, MM, and then RR, and then OO, and then WW, and then you work your way all the way to the middle. You have also words like kayak, race car, reviver level, rotor level, civic, refer, and radar. So palindromes exist, but if you want to make a full sentence out of it, it usually sounds like gibberish in the English language, as well as if, the average Arab person, if they were just to write something, they wouldn't be able to make much sense out of it and still be able to use palindromes. But we find the Quran is actually able to do this. So you can see, for example, in Surah Al-Mudaththir, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, and your Lord glorify. So you can see here, the ra and the ra, the ba and the ba, the kaf and the kaf, and the fa, right? And then وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكْ. So, and each is in an orbit swimming. So this is most likely talking about the celestial bodies here. So you can see the kaf, kaf, lam, lam, fi, so the fa, fa, and the alaf maksura. So we still have this mirror imaging going on in the Quran. So you might be able to come up with a palindrome, but is it going to have in-depth meaning like that of the Quran? Not to mention, it's not just the meaning. It still has that nice rhythm, that nice sound. It's still grammatically correct. It still has a deep overall meaning. And so the Quran achieves this, yet both the Arab and basically the person who speaks English, their palindromes have no match in comparison. Then we have something interesting in the Quran called ring structure. I don't know how early this discovery happened, but you can see, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, if you were to divide Surah Al-Baqarah into 9 parts, you would actually find 9 themes. And you would find this mirror imaging effect that works just like a palindrome. But they like to call it the ring structure, those who kind of notice this pattern. So you'll notice that the opening ayat 1 to 20, and ayat 285 to 286, both focus on the same theme of Iman versus Kufr, or faith versus unbelief. Then you'll find that the next section is talking about Allah's creation. The next section is talking about the deliverance of law, comparing the Musa alayhi salam's ahkam to what the Prophet was given in terms of ahkam or Islamic rulings. And then it talks about the test that would be given first to Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then how the Muslims would be also similarly tested. And then the middle of the Quran talks about the turning of the Qibla. And the Qibla itself is like a turning point for those who followed the previous deens, the previous religions, to follow the completed, most updated version of Islam. It also talks about the changing of the Qibla, which is, it's an act of worship. So that's also a type of switching. And then even the middle ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah is talking about the middle. So it's just very profound how all of that is connected. When you think about the fact that when the Prophet ﷺ received wahi, it would be coming down at different random times. Like sometimes a man would just come up to him, ask him a question, and revelation would come down. Or in some cases, an entire surah would come down in one shot, like Surah Yusuf. Surah Yusuf has the same thing. Surah Yusuf can be divided into 12 parts, and the first part matches the last part, and the second part with the second last part, and the third part with the third last part. But this all came down in one shot. There was no editing. There was no revising of the ayat. It was one shot. It all had this ring structure to it. And this is just another level of the inimitability of the Quran, meaning it cannot be imitated by human beings. You have a question? For the Yahud, it was a big deal. In the book of Daniel, it mentions that Sulaiman alayhi salam, he faced the Qibla of Al-Quds, and he continued to pray in that direction. When the Jews of Medina, they knew there was a prophet that was going to come. We spoke about it, that was in the book of Isaiah, that it mentions that there would be a prophet of justice to come to Mount Sila and let the people rejoice. So what happened was the Yahud, they were actually waiting in Medina. And we have this in the Seerah. We have Bani Qaynuqa and we have Bani Nadir and all these different Jewish tribes within the Medinan Seerah. They were waiting for the Prophet ﷺ to come. When they found out, maybe they kind of maybe knew that he could be Arab, but when they realized that he was an Arab prophet and he wasn't basically exactly like them, then unfortunately the hasad and the racism kicks in, and then all of a sudden they don't want to follow this prophet. And one of the big tests for the Yahud was to change some of their rulings and their ahkam. So for them, they're supposed to face Al-Quds, to Jerusalem, right? And for them, this was a test for them. Are you willing to fully submit and fully turn yourself to God? Or are you going to just pick and choose what parts of the religion you want to follow? So I think maybe this is also part of the interesting dynamic regarding these ayat. There's a YouTube video here. We don't have the time to obviously watch it in class, but whenever I try to give you guys recommendations, it's because there's something really valuable there. This video on YouTube by, I think, Merciful Servant will give you multiple examples of the ring structure if you want to go more into detail on it. Here's another example. Within those 9 themes that we looked at previously, those 9 themes, let me just go back to the previous slide. What they found was that within each of those themes, there was another ring inside of each of those 9 themes. So meaning that the first part of the theme was reiterated in the last part of the theme. So there was many rings inside of the larger ring of the 9 themes. But then even inside of that, there was another ring. So if you go to the very famous verse, Ayatul Kursi, which is considered the greatest verse in the Quran, the verse in and of itself, from the beginning of the ayah to the end of the ayah, it's also following the same mirror structure. So I know it's on the screen in English here, but when it says Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum, that Allah is the only deity worthy of worship, and He is the everlasting, the sustainer of all existence, then His attributes are mentioned in the last part. وَهُوَ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ, and He is the most high, the most great. So when it talks about Allah's attributes, His asma wa sifat, His asma al-husna, in both the beginning and the end. لَا تَأْخُذُهُ سِنَةٌ وَلَا نَوْمٌ, no drowsiness overtakes Him, nor sleep. You look at the second last part of the ayah, and nothing makes Him tired. You can see the mirror effect. The next part of the ayah, to Him belongs everything in the samawati wal ard, right? So you can see the heavens and the earth. The last part about His arsh, His throne, how it extends over the heavens and the earth. Nothing happens without His permission. Fourth section, sixth section, that only things happen by His will. So it's the same concept. And then in the middle, what's interesting is it talks about how He knows everything that happens before and after. And this is mentioned directly in the middle of this section of the ayah. So it's as if it's like almost telling you, He knows everything that comes before this ring structure and everything that comes after this ring structure. On top of this ring structure, this ayah actually has really deep meaning. So this is a ring within another ring of just Surah Al-Baqarah. So you can understand the profound nature of the Quran. I don't even know if the Quraysh at this time, at the time of Wahi, revelation, if they even knew all of this. But this just goes to show what I mentioned last class, which is how the Quran is timeless, how we're always discovering new things about it, whether it's the scientific ayat or these special linguistic features. There's just so much to learn, and once you see even just a glimpse of this stuff, you know for a fact, only Allah could have, revealed this to us. No human being could have come up with something this deep and this elaborate. This is actually the example of Surah Yusuf. I know Numan Ali Khan, he has a summary, which is on the YouTube link that I provided below. So those who are registered students, they have access to the PowerPoint, so they can just go in and they can click on the links. But if you were to just basically, if you're just an audit student, you're just kind of dropping in, then if you were to just go to YouTube and then type in like Surah Yusuf ring structure, probably don't even have to write in Numan Ali Khan, you'll find this particular summary. How in the first part of the 12 parts of the surah, Yusuf has a dream. The last part, the mirror image, it says that his dream was interpreted. The second part, his brothers plot against him. The second last part of the surah, his brothers learn their lesson from what the plot they made against him. The third part, the minister's wife attempts to seduce Yusuf. And then in the third last part, the wife of Al-Aziz confesses to her crime. In the fourth part, it mentions that a similar attempt of the Egyptian ladies happened, and then they also confessed in the fourth last part. And in the fifth part, it mentions that Yusuf is imprisoned. In the sixth last part, Yusuf is freed from prison. And in the sixth part, it mentions that the king's dream is presented. And in the sixth last part, or the mirror image of that, the king's dream is interpreted. So you can see this mirror image, this reflection of the beginning and the later parts of the surah. A beautiful example of ring structure in the Quran. It's also in Surah Al-Buruj. So I'm not going to go through all the examples of the surahs, but again, if you want to look at more details, I would just go to YouTube and type in the name of this surah, Surah Al-Buruj, and then write ring structure, and you should get this animated example where it shows you the ring structure for Surah Al-Buruj as well. I'm not saying it happens for every surah, but the fact that it even happens for some of them just shows the profound nature of the Quran. So in Surah Al-Kawthar, what's interesting is there's a brother, his name is Imran ibn Mansour online. He's like a dawah carrier. He's from the UK. He compared an Eminem song, because Eminem called himself a rap god. So he was really kind of, sort of maybe annoyed at the fact that, Eminem would say something so blasphemous. So then if the guy is claiming that he has like the linguistic features of a rap god, then let's see how his linguistic skills in his rap compares to the Quran. So what brother Imran, Mansour ibn Imran or Imran ibn Mansour, what he ended up finding, I think if you just go to YouTube and you type in like Eminem versus Quran, something like that, the video should come up. He found that if you just take the first 3 words of Surah Al-Kawthar, there are 20 linguistic devices being used, like special poetic devices, in just the first 3 words of Surah Al-Kawthar. If you compare that to Eminem, he only uses 2 literary devices for 2 lines of his rap in comparison. So it just goes to show you like how anything else that the human beings come up with is nowhere near the literary caliber of the Quran. If you want more detail, like I said, there's a full video. It is in the PowerPoint. You can go extensively through it. The guy will talk for 20 minutes about different linguistic Arabic features, and you can get more appreciation for Surah Al-Kawthar. And what else? So do they not reflect upon the Quran? أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. If they had been from anyone other than God, they would have found within it much contradiction. So this is the other thing, is the Quran is free from contradiction. Now also realize is that it is not a contradiction if Allah changes a ruling at a specific time. This is called nasikh wa mansukh. So for example, the issue of changing the qibla, that's changing of rulings. That's well known from all the previous revelation. Certain rulings will change. That is not a contradiction though. That's just a changing of the laws. As far as the belief system, as far as what Allah says, what He promises, you're not going to find any contradictions in the Quran. And as far as the rulings are concerned, it's important to note, because just in case a Christian comes to you or an atheist, and they're like, look, here the ruling changed slightly for prayer. Or look, it says here that you can go to the prayer as long as you're not drunk. So then why does it say that you can't drink alcohol at all in Surah Al-Ma'idah? Because gradually Allah made it more forbidden until it was completely forbidden to drink alcohol. That's just how He chose to do it. But that's not a contradiction. That just means that because Allah is Al-Alim, He took in consideration the fact that this was going to be very difficult for the Muslims to get used to. Because alcohol use was rampant during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Most people drank alcohol, with exception to a few, like the Prophet ﷺ, like Abu Bakr Siddiq. But unfortunately, most people were very used to drinking alcohol prior to the revelation of Islam. These are statements of the kuffar, of Orientalists, of non-Muslims talking about the literary features of the Quran. So even from their perspective, the Quran is unmatched. Now, obviously not everybody's going to say this. Some people are going to be, just trying to attack Islam. But the fact that some of them admitted that the Quran is beyond the skill set of any human being, or even a collection of all human beings, is something to keep in mind. So it mentions here that Bruce Lawrence, who authored a book called The Quran, a biography, so obviously a biography about the Quran, not the Quran itself, for Atlantic Books, page 8, he mentions, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered with meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, who's a Muslim scholar, so in this case we're talking about a Muslim, it's mentioned in Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, it is inimitable, meaning you cannot create something like it. Or make something like it in terms of matching the Quran, because of its balagha, because of its eloquence, its unique usloob, its style, and because it is free of any error. It doesn't have any khata, no mistakes. And then another reference, this is probably from an Orientalist, H.A.R. Gibb from the 1980s. In his book on Islam, A Historical Survey, Oxford University Press, he mentions, like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well, then if the Quran were of his own composition, meaning Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, other men would rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obvious that they could not, then let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. Allah even made the challenge even simpler than this. He said, produce one surah like it. And this, if you know the shortest surahs in the Quran, Surah Al-Asr, 3 ayat, Surah Al-Kawthar, 3 ayat. They could not even come up with 3 ayat to compete with the Quran, let alone something like the size of Surah Al-Baqarah, 286 ayat. Now we have a statement from one of the biggest enemies of Islam, who Allah directly attacked in the Quran. And he was one of Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, as we said earlier. He was one of the main people. He was actually considered kind of like the wise guy of the Shura, of the council of, it's called Majlis al-Nadwa, or Dar al-Nadwa, I think. So it was at the council of Quraysh living in Mecca, And he was like the top guy. He wasn't just the lead poet, he was the lead advisor for all the different tribes of Quraysh on what, and they were debating, what are we going to do with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Like how, well, they wouldn't say sallallahu alaihi wasallam because they're the enemies of Islam, but they were trying to find out how are we going to stop this guy? Because we can't challenge it with we can't challenge the Quran directly. We can't seem to intellectually get them to want to follow a different religion. We can't get them to blindly follow their aba'akum, their forefathers. So what are we going to do? That's when Walid ibn al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, who is the father of Khalid ibn Walid, even though, and we know Khalid ibn Walid is a very famous and big Sahabi, right? He was like one of the biggest generals and fighters and mujahideen of Islam, but unfortunately his father did not accept Islam. So in the case of al-Walid, even though he was the one who tried to say, tell the people that the Quran is a type of sihr, so that if they hear it, then it's going to destroy their families. That's the lie that he tried to spread. So that's why he was trying to get people to get them to plug their ears, especially during the time of Hajj, when a lot of people would come to Mecca. They would be going around telling people, don't listen to this man, Muhammad. If you listen to him, he's going to destroy your family. If you hear his Quran, that's their attack. But even this guy, even this huge enemy of Islam, what did he have to say about Islam when he wasn't in that meeting? When he was asked in all honesty, what do you think of this Quran? This was his response. Keep in mind, one of the biggest enemies of Islam. He said, and what can I say? For I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is none amongst you who knows poetry as well as I do, nor can compete with me in composition or rhetoric, not even the poetry of the jinns. And yet I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muhammad's speech, meaning the Quran, according to his understanding, does not bear any similarity to anything I know. And I swear by Allah Azza wa Jal, the speech that he says is very sweet, and it is adorned with beauty and charm. So he's saying there's nothing like it from mankind or jinn, even though he was a staunch enemy of Islam. So these are just some review questions. Alhamdulillah, we finished the lecture in less than an hour, which is just great because there's an Arabic class after this. So maybe just because in 3 minutes I can kind of summarize this. If you guys want, we can do this interactive where I ask you the questions or I can just tell you the answers to the questions. But first question here, as a bit of a wrap-up review for this lesson, what is the ring structure in the Quran? Does anybody want to answer it, or do you want me to do it? Want me to do it? Or you want?
When you have like a mirror meaning to, let's say you have like 8 you have like 8 events happening in the surah.
Sure.
The first one would mirror the 5th one, second one would mirror the 6th one, and so on until.
So basically what the brother is telling us is that, let's say, I'll just use the example of 10 ayat. If you have 10 ayat in a surah and it has the ring structure, then the first ayah will match the meaning of the 10th, and the second with the 9th, and then the third with the, so right to the middle, right? So the point is there's a mirror image from the two ends of the surah or the ayat, and then as you move towards the middle, the meanings are still matching. So this is the ring structure in the Quran. What is the name of one of the surahs that has ring structure in it? Muhib. Surah what? Yusuf. There's Surah Yusuf, there's also Surah Al-Buruj, and then there was Surah Yusuf, Buruj, and Surah Al-Baqarah. Those three at least have ring structure. How many rhetorical, poetic devices are used in the 10 words that make up Surah Al-Kawthar? I think we talked about the first 3, but we know that at least with the first 3 words, there's already at least 10 rhetorical devices. And compare that to an Eminem song. In 2 lines of his rap, he only had 2 literary devices compared to 10 literary devices in 3 words of the Quran. Who among the greatest enemies of the kuffar from Mecca admitted the Quran is beyond the speech of himself, all of mankind, and all the jinn? Who was that major enemy of Islam who admitted the Quran is beyond the ability of mankind and jinn? Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira. Good. Who was the father of Khalid ibn Walid. And then the last question is, if the Quran and Bible are both from Allah, then why is there contradictions in the current Bible and not in the Quran? We didn't really discuss it, but maybe you guys might know this introspectively. The Quran is the final word. In Surah Al-Hijr, Allah says that He will be the one to protect it, meaning to fully preserve it. And we spoke about earlier in the course that in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 8, verse 8 in the Old Testament, it says about the Bible. It says, how can you say we have the word of God when the scribes, meaning the katibin, the people who wrote it down, have handled it falsely? Meaning they did tahrif, they changed things in the Bible. And even the Quran alludes to this, that the Yahud, they used to pick and choose things and change things regarding the previous scripture. So this obviously helps us to understand why the Quran, first and foremost, is perfectly preserved, and even from a logical point of view, why it needs to be preserved. Because if we're going to call somebody to something, we need to make sure it's the original message. And so in the case of the Quran, it has this promise, unlike all the previous books. So hopefully this was a benefit for you guys today. Next class we'll be doing lecture 12. And like I said, lecture 12 and 13 are new content, and lecture 14 will be the summative review, and then afterwards it'll just be the multiple choice final exam. Jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.